The moment my brother laughed at me, the entire dinner table went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind where everyone suddenly becomes interested in their plate, but is still listening. I was sitting at my parents' dining table in Overland Park, Kansas, the same table we had used for Sunday dinners for almost 20 years. My mother had made roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and green beans, the same meal she had made dozens of times before. The same routine, the same polite conversation, and the same comparison. My older brother Derek leaned back in his chair, one arm draped across the backrest like he owned the room. He was wearing the same tailored navy blazer he liked to wear to family dinners, the one that made him look like he had just stepped out of one of the real estate billboards scattered around Kansas City. I had just finished saying something simple. I said I was thinking about buying property. Derek didn't even try to hide the laugh. It came out sharp and loud, bouncing off the hardwood floor in the glass cabinet behind my mother. Buying property, he repeated. Across the table, my parents exchanged a glance. My father slowly shook his head. My mother gave a quiet little chuckle, like someone had told a harmless joke. "You'll never own a house like your brother," she said. She said it casually, not cruelly, just matter of fact, the way someone might explain the weather. Derek smirked. "She'll be broke forever," he said. No one corrected him. My father nodded once, as if Derek had simply summarized a reality we were all supposed to understand. Around us, the plates and silverware sat untouched for a moment. I could feel the eyes of my parents moving between Derek and me, waiting to see what I would do, waiting for the usual argument, waiting for me to defend myself. Instead, I smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to make it look like the comment hadn't landed the way they expected. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip. Inside my bag, resting against my leg under the table, was a thin folder with several documents inside. None of them had any idea. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I run a boutique event design company in Kansas City called Prairie Ember Events. But at that dinner table, none of that mattered. In my family, success had always been measured by only one thing: property. My brother Derek understood that early. He became a commercial real estate broker straight out of college and never looked back. By 35, he already owned a sleek condo downtown and spent most of his conversations talking about market values, investment properties, and closing deals. My parents adored it. To them, Derek represented stability, predictability, proof that they had raised someone practical. Me, I had chosen something else. My career started with small wedding events, community festivals, and corporate retreats that most people outside the industry never noticed. For years, my parents described it as Natalie's little creative thing. Not a business, not a future, just a hobby that would eventually fade away. So when I mentioned buying property, the reaction wasn't surprising. It was expected. Derek cut another piece of chicken and leaned forward again. "Seriously, Nat," he said. "Real estate around here costs millions." My mother nodded. "You should focus on something stable," she added. My father pointed his fork toward Derek. "Your brother knows what he's doing." I let them talk. I let Derek explain the Kansas City housing market like he was teaching a seminar. And the whole time, I kept that same quiet smile. Because 2 weeks from now, Derek Carter was going to stand in front of a gate he had never seen before. And the person holding the keys on the other side would be me. When dinner ended, I stood, grabbed my bag, and said my goodbyes. No arguments, no explanations, just that same quiet smile. As I stepped out into the cool Kansas evening, I slid my hand into my bag and touched the folder. The property listing inside it was for a building Derek had never heard of, and I was already halfway to owning it. By the time I drove home from that Sunday dinner, the Kansas sky had already turned dark, and the roads through Overland Park were nearly empty. But Derek's words followed me the whole way. She'll be broke forever. The strange thing was, it didn't sting the way it might have 10 years earlier. Because that dinner hadn't been unusual. It had simply been the clearest example of a pattern that had been there most of my life. Growing up in the Carter house, success had always had a very specific definition: stability, predictability, and most importantly, ownership. My father, Richard Carter, believed in those things with quiet certainty. He had spent 30 years working for the same insurance company in Kansas City. Every morning, he left the house at 7:30 sharp. Every evening, he returned at 5:30. And every conversation at our dinner table somehow circled back to responsibility and planning for the future. My mother, Susan Carter, shared the same worldview. To her, a good life meant consistency, a steady paycheck, a reliable house in a quiet neighborhood, and a son like Derek. Derek Carter was 4 years older than me, and from the time we were teenagers, it seemed obvious he had inherited exactly what our parents valued. He understood money. He understood property. Even in college, he talked about market trends and investment strategies like someone twice his age. When he graduated and joined a commercial real estate brokerage in Kansas City, my parents treated it like the final confirmation that he was on the right path. I still remember the night he bought his first condo downtown. My parents hosted a dinner almost identical to the one we had just sat through. My father opened a bottle of wine he had been saving, and my mother insisted on taking pictures of Derek, standing proudly in front of the building. "That's what smart decisions look like," my father said that night. At the time, I was 23 and working my first event job, coordinating decorations and seating charts for weddings across Johnson County. I loved it, the creativity, the energy, the satisfaction of watching a room transform from an empty space into something beautiful. But at our dinner table, those details rarely mattered. Whenever my parents asked about work, the conversation always followed the same shape. "How's the little event thing going?" my mother would ask. I would explain a new project, a venue we had booked, or a corporate retreat I was helping organize. My father would listen politely for about 30 seconds before steering the conversation back toward Derek. "Did you hear about the building Derek just helped sell downtown?" he would say. Then the spotlight shifted. Derek describing square footage. Derek explaining profit margins. Derek talking about closing deals. And my parents nodding proudly. Over the years, the pattern became so predictable that I stopped trying to interrupt it. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted. In their minds, Derek was the responsible one, the one with the future, and I was the creative one, still figuring things out. The funny thing is, none of them ever asked detailed questions about my work. Not once. They never asked how many events I was managing in a year. They never asked who my clients were. They never asked how Prairie Ember Events was actually doing. They simply assumed that Derek's World Contracts Buildings Investments was the real one, and that mine was temporary. I used to think their opinions mattered more than they probably should have. When I was younger, I would drive home from dinners, replaying conversations in my head, wishing I had explained things better, wishing I had defended myself. But eventually, something changed. Instead of trying to convince them, I stopped talking. Not out of anger, out of practicality. If they already believed they understood my life, correcting them felt pointless. So over time, I built a quiet wall between my work and my family. Sunday dinners stayed exactly the same. My parents praising Derek, Derek offering advice nobody asked for, and me sitting there smiling politely, saying very little. What none of them realized was that while they were repeating the same conversations year after year, my life outside that dining room had been changing, growing, expanding in ways they had never bothered to notice. And eventually, that quiet difference was going to become impossible to ignore. The funny thing about being underestimated is how quiet it makes your life become. Not because nothing is happening, but because the people who think they understand you stop asking questions. By the time I turned 30, my parents had already decided who I was. Natalie, the creative daughter. Natalie, the one still figuring things out. Natalie, the one who hadn't quite become practical yet. So eventually, I stopped correcting them. I simply stopped explaining. Outside of those Sunday dinners in Overland Park, my life looked very different. Most mornings started early in a small office space I rented above a coffee shop in Kansas City's River Market District. It wasn't glamorous, but it had tall windows, old hardwood floors, and enough room for the work I loved. That space was where Prairie Ember events really came to life. Prairie Ember had started years earlier with weddings, small ones, at first backyard ceremonies, community centers, and local venues around Johnson County. I designed the layouts, coordinated vendors, and made sure everything looked exactly the way the couple imagined. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply satisfying. Watching an empty room slowly transform into something elegant never stopped feeling a little magical. Over time, the work changed. Word of mouth spread. A corporate client hired us for a leadership retreat outside Kansas City. Then another company asked us to design a product launch event. Then a nonprofit invited us to coordinate their annual fundraising gala. Each event led to another. Each client introduced us to someone new. And slowly, Prairie Ember Events stopped being a side project. It became a real business. By my early 30s, my small team handled events across the entire Kansas City area. We organized conferences, executive retreats, and high-end celebrations that required months of planning. None of this happened overnight. It took years of late nights, spreadsheets, vendor negotiations, and careful budgeting. One of the few people who saw the full picture was Marcus Delgado. Marcus was a financial advisor I had started working with 3 years earlier after a client recommended him. His office sat in a quiet, brick building near Union Station, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Marcus was calm, practical, and very good with numbers. He was also one of the only people who asked detailed questions about my business. How many events did Prairie Ember handle this quarter? He asked one afternoon while reviewing my financial reports. 27, I said. He raised an eyebrow. That's growth. Marcus tapped his pen against the page, studying the numbers carefully. You realize you're sitting on something bigger than you think, Natalie. I shrugged a little when he said that. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I had grown used to a very different reaction at family dinners. At home, success was measured by square footage and mortgage payments. At Prairie Ember, success looked different. It looked like a ballroom filled with guests, a schedule that ran on time, a client smiling when the lights dimmed and the music began. Marcus closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. Have you thought about investing some of this revenue? He asked. In what way? He leaned back in his chair. Property would make sense. For a moment, I just sat there thinking. The word property had always belonged to Derek's world. Buildings, contracts, closing deals. Marcus didn't know anything about my family dinners. He didn't know how often Derek talked about real estate like it was the only proof of success that mattered. But sitting in that office, looking down at the financial reports from Prairie Ember Events, I realized something quietly surprising. For the first time in my life, property might actually be within reach. I didn't say anything right away. I simply gathered my papers, thanked Marcus for his time, and stepped out into the Kansas City afternoon. The River Market streets were busy, sunlight reflecting off the glass windows of the surrounding buildings. I walked past a row of old brick warehouses that had been converted into studios, offices, and lofts, and for the first time, I found myself wondering what it might look like to own one. The following Tuesday morning, Kansas City woke under a thin layer of gray clouds. I arrived at the Prairie Ember Events office just after 8, coffee in hand, the same way I had every workday for years. The River Market District was already awake, delivery trucks backing into alleys, cafe owners pulling open their doors, the low hum of early commuters filling the streets. On the surface, nothing about the morning was unusual, but Derek's words from Sunday night were still echoing in the back of my mind. You'll never own a house like your brother. Normally, I would have pushed a comment like that aside and focused on work. Over the years, I had gotten very good at compartmentalizing family dinners from the rest of my life. But this time, something about it stayed with me. Maybe it was the way my parents nodded along. Maybe it was the certainty in Derek's voice. Or maybe it was because of the conversation I'd had with Marcus only a few days earlier. Property would make sense. I set my bag down on the desk and opened my laptop, intending to review a schedule for an upcoming corporate retreat we were planning outside Kansas City. Prairie Ember had 3 major events scheduled over the next 2 months, each requiring detailed coordination. Normally, that kind of workload kept my mind busy. But instead of opening my project files, I found myself opening a different browser tab. Real estate listings. The search results filled the screen: condos, downtown, small suburban homes, renovated townhouses. Most of them looked exactly like the properties Derek talked about at family dinners. Safe, predictable. None of them caught my attention. I was about to close the page when one listing stood out. It wasn't a house. It was an old brick warehouse in Kansas City's Crossroads Arts District that had recently been converted into a mixed-use loft space. The photos showed tall industrial windows, exposed beams, and an open floor plan that looked large enough to hold an entire event design studio. I clicked through the images slowly. The building sat on a quiet corner street, surrounded by art galleries, small design studios, and renovated creative spaces. The listing description mentioned that the property could function as both residential and commercial space. I leaned back in my chair, studying the photos. It didn't look anything like Derek's sleek condo, but the more I looked at it, the more it felt familiar, creative, flexible, a space where Prairie Ember Events could grow. At that moment, my office door opened slightly. Morning, Natalie. I looked up to see Emma Grayson, one of our event coordinators, stepping inside with a tablet in her hands. Emma had joined Prairie Ember 2 years earlier, after working at a hotel conference center, and she had quickly become one of the most organized people on the team. We just got confirmation from the Lakeside Retreat venue, she said. They approved the new layout for the executive summit. That's great, I said, forcing my attention back to the present. Emma noticed the listing on my laptop screen. Looking for office space, she asked casually. I hesitated for a second. Just browsing. Emma glanced at the photos again. "That place looks incredible," she said. "Crossroads is becoming the creative hub of the city." She wasn't wrong. Over the past decade, the district had transformed into one of the most vibrant areas in Kansas City, full of design studios, galleries, and event venues. Emma returned to the conference room to prepare for the team meeting, but I stayed at my desk staring at the listing. I thought about the years Prairie Ember had spent working out of rented spaces, temporary studios, shared offices, storage units for decorations and equipment, always moving, always adapting. The warehouse, in the photos, looked different, permanent. For a moment, Derek's voice echoed again in my head. "She'll be broke forever." I closed the laptop slowly, not because the idea had disappeared, but because something about it suddenly felt much more real. And if there was one thing I had learned after years in the event business, it was this: the biggest decisions rarely announce themselves loudly. They begin quietly, like a thought you can't quite let go of. Before leaving the office that evening, I wrote down the name of the listing agent at the bottom of the page, Elaine Porter. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into the same folder that had been sitting in my bag since Sunday night. For now, it was just a possibility. But possibilities have a way of changing everything. By Thursday afternoon, the idea had stopped feeling like a fantasy and started feeling like a decision. I was sitting in Marcus Delgado's office, again the same quiet room near Union Station, with its polished wood desk, framed certificates, and the faint smell of coffee that never seemed to leave the air. My financial reports were spread out between us, along with profit and loss statements from Prairie Ember events tax records, and a folder marked with the Crossroads property address. Marcus had already gone through everything once, then twice. Now he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You can do this," he said. "Not you might, not maybe if the stars align. You can do this." For a second, I just looked at him. Outside his office window, traffic moved steadily through downtown Kansas City, and somewhere below us, a siren wailed and faded. The world kept moving like normal, but inside that room, something in me shifted. Because this wasn't just about a building anymore. It was about whether I was finally willing to believe my own life more than my family's version of it. "Talk to me honestly," I said, not as someone trying to encourage me, as the person who sees the numbers. Marcus didn't flinch. "You have the revenue. You have the reserves. And more importantly, you have a business that's stable enough to support a move like this if you stay disciplined." That last part mattered. Disciplined. That was a word my father liked to use when he talked about Derek, as if responsibility had only ever belonged to one child in our family. Marcus opened the folder and turned one of the pages toward me. It was a breakdown of the projected costs. Purchase price, closing fees, renovation, budget taxes, insurance, real numbers, concrete numbers. The kind no one could laugh away at a dinner table. "There's risk," he said. "There's always risk. But this isn't reckless." I nodded slowly. All my life, people like Derek had spoken about risk, as if it only counted when it lived in my world. Creative risk, career risk, personal risk. But property speculation, leveraged deals, and market bets somehow got to wear a nicer suit and call themselves strategy. I looked down at the property address again. The old warehouse in the Crossroads Arts District. Brick exterior, tall windows, mixed-use zoning, a place to live, a place to build, a place no one in my family would ever associate with me, because none of them had ever taken the time to understand what I was actually creating. That was when the thought became clear. If I bought it, I wasn't going back to the smaller version of myself they preferred. I wasn't going to keep shrinking my life to fit their assumptions. Marcus watched me for a moment, then pushed a pen toward me. This is just the authorization to move forward with the offer, he said. Not the closing documents, but once we start, things move. I stared at the pen. That should have felt small, routine, paperwork. But it didn't. It felt like a line, because until that moment, silence had protected me. If I kept my life private, they could underestimate me, and I could tell myself it didn't matter. I could stay removed, untouched, safe. But this would become real, permanent. A deed, a set of keys, a building with my name attached to it. I picked up the pen, and in that instant, I understood something I hadn't been willing to say out loud before. I wasn't just buying a property. I was ending the version of my life where my family got to define what success looked like. I signed the authorization and slid it back across the desk. Marcus gave a small nod. Professional, but approving. "Then we begin," he said. When I left his office, the late afternoon sun had broken through the clouds and turned the city glass gold. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding the folder against my chest. Inside it were papers no one in my family knew existed. Not Derek, not my mother, not my father. For the first time in years, I wasn't just staying quiet to keep the peace. I was staying quiet because I had finally chosen a direction they could not interrupt. And once the process started, there would be no graceful way to step backward again. The following week, the building stopped being an address on paper and started becoming part of my life. Closing had happened on a Monday afternoon, quietly and without ceremony. By Wednesday, I was standing inside the old brick warehouse in the Crossroads Arts District with a set of keys in one hand and a legal pad in the other, walking room to room while morning light poured through the tall industrial windows. Empty buildings have a strange honesty to them. They don't flatter you. They don't hide what they need. The floors needed refinishing. The upstairs plumbing needed work. One wall still held the faded outline of old shelving from when the place had been used for storage years ago. But the bones were solid. The ceilings were high. The open layout gave the whole place a sense of possibility I could feel in my chest. For the first time, I wasn't picturing someone else's success. I was picturing mine. That week, my days split in two. Mornings at Prairie Ember events, where Emma Grayson kept our schedules running and fielded vendor calls with her usual calm precision. Afternoons at the building meeting, contractors choosing paint samples, measuring walls, and deciding where the studio side would end and the living space would begin. The first person to understand what the place could become was Lila Chen, an interior architect Elaine Porter had recommended after the closing. Lila was practical, quick-eyed, and not easily impressed. She stepped into the warehouse, looked around once, and said, "You don't need to make this look expensive. It already has character. You need to make it look intentional." That word stayed with me. Intentional. The downstairs would become the Prairie Ember Design Studio and Consultation Space. The upstairs loft would be mine. Not flashy, not staged for anyone else's approval. Just clean lines, warm wood, and enough room to breathe. At the front of the building sat the old iron gate that opened from the sidewalk into a narrow courtyard entry. Rusted in places, sturdy in others, it looked like something people had stopped noticing years ago. I didn't stop noticing it. I had it sanded, repainted matte black, and rehung so it swung cleanly. Then I ordered a discreet brass plaque for the brick column beside it. Prairie Ember Events. No apology in the lettering, no explanation, just the name. By Friday evening, I was standing outside the gate when my phone buzzed with a family group text from my mother. Sunday dinner, same time as always. Your father wants everyone there. A few seconds later, Derek added his own message. Try not to be late, Nat. Some of us have real work on Mondays. I stared at the screen a moment longer than I needed to. Then, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I took a photo of the gate with the new plaque catching the late sunlight and sent it privately to Derek. No caption, just the image. He replied, less than a minute later, "Nice rental." I could almost hear the smirk in it. A second message followed. "Crossroads is trendy. Hope your clients can cover the overhead." That was Derek's version of defense. Dismiss first. Shrink it before it had the chance to become real. I slid my phone back into my coat pocket and looked up at the building. He still thought he understood the shape of my life. So did my parents. That was fine. The truth didn't need defending yet. Inside, the workers were finishing the last of the lighting installation. Upstairs, boxes waited to be unpacked. Downstairs, the studio was beginning to look like the place I had been building toward for years, without even knowing it. The risk was real now. So were the bills, the renovations, the long nights, and the pressure of making all of it work. But for the first time, that pressure belonged to me. And standing there at the gate, with my company's name on the brick, and Derek's dismissive message still glowing in my pocket, I realized something simple. He had already started underestimating the wrong version of me. The first sign that things were changing didn't come from my family. It came from the internet. 3 days after the renovation, crews finished installing the studio, lighting Prairie Ember Events, hosted its first client walkthrough in the new Crossroads building. It wasn't a party or a public launch, just a working visit with a corporate client planning a leadership retreat for the PIL. Still, Emma had arranged the space carefully. Fresh flowers near the entrance, sample table settings in the studio area, fabric boards and design sketches displayed along one wall. The sunlight coming through the tall windows gave the entire room a warm glow that felt almost cinematic. As the client left that afternoon, Emma pulled out her phone. "Mind if I post a quick preview?" she asked. "Nothing sensitive, just the studio." I hesitated for a moment. Then I nodded. Within minutes, she had posted a photo on Prairie Ember's Instagram page. It showed the front courtyard through the iron gate, the brick wall beside it, and the small brass plaque with our name on it. Prairie Ember Events, new studio space in Crossroads. The post started gaining attention almost immediately. A few local vendors commented first. Then a wedding planner I'd worked with last year. Then someone tagged a Kansas City events group that followed new venues and creative spaces. By the end of the afternoon, the photo had been shared more than I expected. That was when Derek found it. I didn't know exactly how he came across the post, but I learned later that a mutual acquaintance in Kansas City's business circles had sent him the image. When my phone buzzed that evening, his message appeared on the screen without any greeting. "Whose building is that?" I read the message twice. Not congratulations, not curiosity, just suspicion. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I finished locking up the studio, stepped outside the iron gate, and looked back at the building under the dim streetlights. The brick walls looked darker at night, the windows reflecting the glow of nearby galleries and restaurants. It was still mine. That fact felt solid, In a way, nothing Derek said could change. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. It's where Prairie Ember is working now. The typing dots appeared almost instantly. That doesn't answer the question Derek wrote. Then, another message. Did you get hired by someone big? I could picture the expression on his face while he wrote it, the same confident skepticism he used at family dinners when he explained why something I was doing couldn't possibly work. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying, but Derek didn't stop there. Later that night, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. Her voice sounded cautious when I picked up. Natalie, your brother showed us a photo of some building online, she said. He thinks you're working for someone there. Working for someone. Even now, the assumption came naturally. It's part of my company, I said. There was a pause on the line. Oh, she said softly. Not disbelief, just uncertainty. Then she added something that made it clear Derek had already started forming his own version of the story. Well, he says those places in Crossroads are expensive, she continued. So I hope you're not overextending yourself. Overextending. Another quiet warning disguised as concern. After we hung up, I sat alone in the studio for a long time, staring across the open floor toward the iron gate outside. Derek had done what he always did. The moment something didn't fit the picture he had in his head, he tried to reduce it, reframe it, turn it into something smaller. But this time, his doubt had spread beyond the dinner table. Now people were asking questions. Clients, vendors, even my family. And once the truth started moving through the same networks, Derek had always dominated Kansas City's business community. Its property circles, its quiet web of professional reputations. It wouldn't stay quiet for long. The building had already changed my life. Now, it was beginning to change the story everyone thought they knew about it. By Saturday afternoon, I had already decided on one thing. If my family came, I wasn't going to explain myself into their understanding. I had spent too many years trying to make my life sound reasonable to people who had already chosen not to respect it. That was the mistake I could see clearly now. I had always assumed that if I found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, something would finally shift. It never had. So that afternoon, I kept working. The downstairs studio was nearly ready for a formal client presentation the following week. Emma was inside reviewing linen samples at the long consultation table, and I was outside near the front courtyard, checking the new planter boxes we had set beside the iron gate. The brass plaque on the brick column caught the light every time the sun broke through the clouds. Prairie Ember Events. No one could talk that name into something smaller. I heard the car before I saw it. A dark gray SUV slowed at the corner, then turned and pulled to the curb in front of the building. Even from a distance, I recognized the shape of my father in the driver's seat and my mother's careful posture beside him. Derek climbed out first. For one strange second, nobody moved. Then Derek looked up at the building, at the windows at the gate, and finally at me. He wasn't smiling. That was new. My mother stepped out next, her purse clutched tight against her side. My father followed more slowly, already studying the exterior, like he was trying to calculate value from the sidewalk. They walked toward the entrance, but none of them touched the gate. I stayed where I was. Derek spoke first. So this is the place. Not a question, not a compliment, just a statement edged with suspicion. This is the place, I said. My mother glanced from me to the plaque and back again. Natalie, she said carefully, who owns this building? There it was, The question Derek had, asked through a phone screen, now sounded different in person. He wanted a loophole, a technicality, a reason this could still fit the story he preferred. I rested one hand on the gate and answered, without adding anything extra. I do. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said at the Sunday dinner. My father frowned first, almost automatically. You mean your company leases it? No, I said. I bought it. Derek gave a short laugh, but it landed flat. Come on, he said. Crossroads commercial space doesn't work like that. I held his gaze. It closed this month. For the first time in my life, I watched Derek search my face for uncertainty and fail to find it. My mother looked past me, through the open courtyard, toward the studio inside, where Emma was still moving samples across the table. The room looked polished, established, lived in. This is really yours? She asked. I nodded. My father's expression tightened. How much did you overextend yourself for this? There it was again. Not pride, not surprise, a warning shaped like criticism. Before I could answer, Derek stepped closer to the gate. You should have called me, he said, his voice sharpening. If you were getting into commercial property without understanding the risks, that's not smart. He said it like concern, but it was defense. I could hear it now. His authority slipping, and his instinct was to reclaim it by turning my success into a mistake. That was the insight I hadn't had before. Derek didn't need facts to feel secure. He needed me to stay below him. I opened the gate just enough to step through it, then let it swing shut behind me with a clean, metallic click. Not dramatic, just clear. I wasn't looking for advice, I said. No one answered right away. The building stood behind me, solid and undeniable. My company's name was on the brick. The keys were in my pocket. The paperwork was already filed. Whatever version of me they had carried for years had finally run out of space to stand in. Derek looked at the plaque again, then back at me. And for the first time, he had nothing ready to say. They came back 4 days later. This time, it was early evening, just after I had finished a client call in the upstairs loft. The studio downstairs was quiet, the last of the team gone for the day, and the building had settled into that soft stillness that comes after work is over. I was making tea in my kitchen when I heard a car door slam outside the iron gate. I didn't have to look to know it was them. Some part of me had been expecting it ever since Saturday. When I stepped to the front window, I saw my parents standing just beyond the gate, Derek, a few feet behind them, with his hand shoved into the pockets of his coat. The confidence he wore so easily at family dinners was gone. Even from inside, I could see it in the way he held his shoulders. I opened the front door, but not the gate. My mother spoke first. Natalie, we need to talk. Her voice had changed. It no longer carried that careful, dismissive tone she used when discussing my work. Now it sounded strained, almost breathless. I stayed where I was. What is it? My father cleared his throat, a habit he had whenever he was about to say something he didn't want to say. It's Derek, he said. He's in a difficult position. Derek still didn't meet my eyes. My mother stepped closer to the gate. There was an investment, she said. A commercial redevelopment deal. He put money into it with 2 partners, and now it's fallen apart. For a second, no one said anything else. Then my father added, he may have to cover losses personally. There it was. The real reason they had come. Not concern, not reconciliation, not even shame. Need. I looked at Derek then. He finally raised his head, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. It was supposed to close this month, he said. The financing collapsed. Then, one of the partners backed out. It's complicated. Complicated. That was a convenient word. The same man who had laughed across a dinner table and called me broke forever was now standing outside my gate, asking the world to be more nuanced about his own failure. My mother gripped the bars lightly, as if she could soften the distance between us with her hands. "You're doing well, Natalie," she said carefully. "You have this building now. A business. We thought maybe—" She let the sentence trail off, but she didn't need to finish it. "My father did it for her. Maybe you could help your brother get through this." The words landed with a strange calm inside me. Not because they hurt less, because they made everything simple. All my life, I had mistaken my family's favoritism for misunderstanding. I had told myself maybe they just didn't see me clearly. Maybe if they knew more, they would treat me differently. But standing there, looking at my parents through the black iron bars, I finally understood that they had seen exactly what was useful to them all along. When Derek was winning, he was the joke. Now that Derek was losing, I was the backup plan. Derek took one step forward. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said quickly. "Just short-term help. Something to stabilize things." I almost laughed at that. He had spent years using my life as an example of what failure looked like. Now he wanted to borrow stability from the very person he had publicly dismissed. I stepped closer to the gate, close enough that none of them could mistake what I was about to say for hesitation. "No," I said. My mother blinked. "Natalie, no," I repeated more firmly this time. "You don't get to mock my life when it suits you, and then show up here when you need it." Derek's face hardened, the old defensiveness flashing back for a moment. "This is family," he said. I held his gaze. "No," I said quietly. "This is consequence." Then I put my hand on the gate. "Leave my property." For one long second, nobody moved. Then my father lowered his eyes. My mother let go of the iron bars. Derek stared at me, like he was still waiting for the version of me who would fold under pressure. She wasn't there anymore. I closed the door before any of them could say another word. But even after the lock clicked, my heart didn't settle. Because justice had started. It just didn't feel like peace yet. For the first few days, after I told them to leave my property, the silence felt unfamiliar. Not peaceful. Not yet. Just unfamiliar. I still woke up early, made coffee in the upstairs kitchen, and looked down through the tall windows at the quiet street below. The iron gate stood where it always had, matte black against the brick, solid and still. For years, I had thought boundaries would feel harsh when I finally set them. I thought I would spend days second-guessing myself, replaying every word. Instead, what I felt most was clarity. My parents didn't call again that week. Derek sent one short text on Monday night. "You didn't have to do that." I looked at the message for a long time before deleting it. The truth was I did have to do that. Not because I wanted revenge in the loud, dramatic way people imagine. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because every relationship in my family had been built around one assumption, that Derek would always be the one they protected, and I would always be the one expected to absorb the insult, stay quiet, and remain available when it was convenient. Closing the door had ended that arrangement. A week later, the consequences started becoming visible. I heard, through a vendor who knew someone in commercial real estate, that Derek's redevelopment deal had collapsed publicly. One of his partners had pulled out the financing, had failed, and word was already spreading through the same Kansas City business circles where Derek had once moved so comfortably. People weren't cruel about it. They didn't have to be. In tight professional communities, silence and raised eyebrows do enough. My parents felt it too. At the next Sunday dinner, they didn't send the usual group text. no invitation, no cheerful reminder from my mother. For the first time in years, the ritual stopped on its own. I spent that Sunday at the building instead. Emma came by in the afternoon to finalize a presentation board for a fall client. We worked downstairs at the long consultation table, while soft jazz played through the studio speakers. The place smelled faintly of cedar from the refinished floors and fresh paint from the upstairs loft. At one point, Emma looked around the room and smiled. "This place fits you," she said. I didn't answer right away, because I knew she wasn't only talking about the building. By then, the studio was fully operational. Prairie Ember's new client calendar was filling up. Vendors had started referring to the Crossroads property by name. The brass plaque by the gate was no longer an announcement. It was simply true. That was the part I hadn't expected. Healing didn't arrive in one big moment. It arrived in ordinary ones. Unlocking the front door in the morning, hearing my own footsteps on the hardwood upstairs, reviewing contracts at the kitchen counter without dread sitting in my chest, knowing that what I had built was real, and that I no longer needed anyone's permission to call it success. I still thought about my family sometimes. I probably always would, but the ache had changed shape. It no longer felt like a wound I was waiting for them to notice. It felt like distance, honest distance, and there was peace in that. That Friday evening, after our last client left, I stepped outside and locked the iron gate behind me. The streetlights were coming on across Crossroads, and the brass plaque caught the last of the sunset. Prairie Ember Events. My name wasn't on the brick, but my life was, and for the first time, that was more than enough. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your dignity, I'd love to know what that looked like for you. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And if stories like this stay with you, like, subscribe, and come with me into the next one.